What you are about to hear happened on Christmas Eve 2024 in Denver, Colorado. A routine call, an abandoned warehouse, and a discovery that would leave experienced firefighters questioning everything they thought they knew. This is the story of Captain Michael Torres and what his crew found on the coldest night of the year. Michael Torres was 52 years old and had been with the Denver Fire Department for 28 years. If you've ever met a firefighter who seems to have seen everything, who stays calm when everyone else is panicking, who can walk into chaos and bring order, that was Captain Torres. He was a big man, 6'3", with the kind of presence that made you feel safer just knowing he was there. His hair was mostly gray now, cut military short, and his face had the deep lines that come from years of smoke, heat, and stress. But his eyes, those dark brown eyes, they were still sharp, still kind. Torres wasn't particularly religious. He'd been raised Catholic, went to church with his grandmother as a child, but as an adult, he rarely thought about faith. He believed in his training, in his crew, in the equipment. Those were things he could count on. The rest? He wasn't sure about the rest. Christmas Eve of 2024 was brutally cold in Denver, the kind of cold that makes your face hurt, that turns your breath into thick clouds, that seeps through your clothes no matter how many layers you wear. It was 11:43 p.m. when the call came in. Torres and his crew, Engine 24, were at the station, most of them trying to stay awake until midnight, drinking bad coffee and half watching a basketball game on the old TV in the common room. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Engine 24, we have a report of smoke coming from the old Riverside warehouse on 38th Street. Possible structure fire. Torres was on his feet immediately, as were the rest of his crew. Danny Martinez, 34, 8 years on the job, quick and smart. Sarah Chen, 29, 5 years in, tough as they come. And Jake Williams, the rookie, just 23, 6 months out of the academy, still eager, still believing he could save everyone. They were in the truck in under a minute, sirens wailing as they pulled out into the frozen night. The streets were nearly empty. Most people were home with their families, warm, safe, celebrating. Torres looked out the window as they drove, seeing the Christmas lights on houses, the decorated trees visible through windows, the life happening inside those homes while he and his crew headed toward whatever waited for them at the warehouse. The Riverside warehouse had been abandoned for 3 years. It was one of those buildings that the city kept meaning to do something about but never quite got around to. 5 stories of old brick and broken windows, a remnant from when this part of Denver had been industrial, before everything moved further out. Now it was just a shell, home to nothing but pigeons and occasionally people who had nowhere else to go. When Engine 24 pulled up, Torres could see the smoke immediately. Not thick, not the black billowing kind that meant a major fire, but thin gray wisps coming from a third-floor window. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch, Engine 24 on scene, light smoke visible, 3rd floor. We're going in. The crew geared up quickly, efficiently, the way they'd done 1,000 times before. Helmets, coats, gloves, air tanks. Torres checked everyone, made sure everything was secure. Standard procedure, but he never skipped it. Not once in 28 years. They entered through the front where the doors had been chained shut, but the chains had long since been cut by someone. Inside, the building was dark and cold, somehow even colder than outside. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating graffiti-covered walls, piles of debris, the remnants of what this place had once been. The smell hit them immediately. Not smoke exactly, but something burning. Something that shouldn't be burning. "Let's move," Torres said, his voice calm, authoritative. "Stay together. Stay alert." They climbed the stairs, boots echoing in the empty space. 2nd floor, nothing. 3rd floor, the smoke was thicker here, and Torres could see the orange glow of fire coming from a room at the end of the hallway. They moved toward it, ready with the hose, ready for whatever they'd find. But nothing could have prepared them for what they actually found. The room was maybe 20 feet square, an old office or storage space, it was hard to tell. There was a fire, but it was small, contained in a metal barrel in the corner, the kind people use to stay warm when they're sleeping rough. Old newspapers and pieces of wood were burning, creating more smoke than heat. That wasn't unusual. Torres had responded to dozens of calls like this over the years, people trying to stay warm in abandoned buildings, fires that got out of control or at least created enough smoke for someone to notice and call it in. Danny moved forward with the extinguisher, putting out the fire quickly, efficiently. The smoke began to clear, and that's when Torres saw the rest of the room. In the corner opposite the barrel, someone had created a space. There were blankets, old but relatively clean, folded neatly. A few canned goods stacked carefully. A battery-powered lantern that was still on, casting a warm yellow glow. And in the center of it all, on a wooden crate that served as a table, was a statue of the Virgin Mary. Torres had seen religious items in places like this before. People living on the streets often carried symbols of faith, small reminders of hope or comfort, or simply something familiar. But this statue, there was something different about it. It was about 2 feet tall, made of plaster or ceramic, painted with remarkable detail. The Virgin Mary's robes were a deep blue, and her face, even in the dim light, seemed incredibly peaceful, serene. Her hands were extended outward, as if offering something, or perhaps welcoming someone. "Captain," Sarah said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Torres turn immediately. She was standing near the blankets, her flashlight pointed downward. "You need to see this." Torres walked over, and his heart dropped. There, wrapped in blankets, barely visible, was a baby. An infant, couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The baby was crying, not a loud wail, but a weak, mewling sound that was somehow worse because it spoke of exhaustion, of a child who had been crying for too long. "Jesus," Danny whispered behind him. Torres knelt down immediately, his training taking over. He gently unwrapped the blankets, checking the baby. A girl, he noted, maybe 3 weeks old, a month at most. Her skin was cold to the touch, not dangerously so, but cold enough to be concerning. She was dressed in a onesie that looked clean, and the blankets, while old, were layered carefully, as if someone had tried very hard to keep her warm. "Jake, call for an ambulance," Torres said, his voice steady despite the shock coursing through his system. "Tell them we have an infant, approximately 3 to 4 weeks old, conscious and breathing but cold, possible hypothermia, and call police. We need them here now." Jake was already on the radio, his voice shaking slightly as he relayed the information. Sarah was searching the rest of the room, looking for anyone else, for the baby's mother, for whoever had been here. "There's no one else here," Sarah said after a thorough check. "No one in this room, no one on this floor. It's just the baby." Torres carefully picked up the infant, holding her against his chest, using his body heat to warm her. She continued to cry, that weak sound that broke something inside him. In all his years as a firefighter, all the things he'd seen, the accidents and fires and tragedies, there was something about holding this tiny, helpless life that cut through all his professional detachment. "Who would leave a baby here?" Danny asked, and there was anger in his voice now, anger and confusion. "On Christmas Eve in an abandoned warehouse, in this cold?" "I don't know," Torres said quietly, "but we're going to find out." It was then that he noticed something strange. The room, despite the cold outside, despite the small fire having just been put out, felt warmer than it should. Not uncomfortably warm, but comfortable, almost pleasant. And there was a smell, faint but present, that didn't fit with the environment. It smelled like, Torres tried to place it, like flowers, specifically like roses. Fresh roses, the kind his wife sometimes bought for their dining room table. "Do you smell that?" he asked, looking at his crew. Sarah frowned, sniffing the air. "Roses? In here?" Danny walked around the room trying to locate the source. "There are no flowers here, Captain. Nothing that could smell like that." Torres looked down at the baby in his arms. She had stopped crying, was looking up at him with dark eyes that seemed far too aware for someone so young. Then he looked at the statue of the Virgin Mary, still sitting on the crate, illuminated by the battery-powered lantern. In that light, the blue of her robe seemed to glow softly, and her face, Torres could have sworn her expression had changed, though he knew that was impossible. Statues don't change. They're just painted plaster or ceramic or whatever material they're made from. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at the baby, that somehow, impossibly, that statue had been watching over this child. The sound of sirens broke through his thoughts. The ambulance was arriving, and shortly after, the police. Torres carried the baby carefully down the stairs and outside, where the paramedics immediately took over, checking her vitals, wrapping her in warming blankets, preparing to transport her to Denver Children's Hospital. A police officer, Detective Lisa Freeman, approached Torres. She was a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an expression that said she'd seen too much of humanity's dark side. "Tell me what you found, Captain." Torres explained everything: the fire, the room, the carefully arranged space, the statue, and the baby. Freeman took notes, asked questions, her expression growing darker with each detail. "We'll search the building thoroughly," she said, "and we'll start looking for the mother or whoever left this baby here. This is criminal abandonment at minimum." As the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing but no siren, the baby was stable enough not to need that. Torres stood there in the cold, watching it disappear into the night. His crew stood beside him, all of them quiet, processing what they'd just experienced. "Captain," Jake said hesitantly, "that statue. Did you notice anything weird about it?" Torres looked at the rookie. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it, but when I looked at it, I felt..." Jake struggled for the words. "I felt like everything was going to be okay, like someone was telling me the baby would be fine." Torres nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I felt that too." The baby was named Rosa by the hospital staff, a temporary name until her real identity could be established or until she was placed with social services. Torres couldn't stop thinking about her. He finished his shift at 7 a.m. on Christmas morning, went home to his wife Maria and their 2 teenage children, tried to enjoy the holiday, but his mind kept going back to that warehouse, to that room, to the statue watching over a helpless infant. 2 days after Christmas, Torres visited Denver Children's Hospital. He told himself he was just checking on her condition for his report, but he knew that wasn't entirely true. He needed to see her, needed to know she was okay. The nurses, recognizing him as the firefighter who'd found her, led him into the NICU. Rosa was in an incubator, sleeping peacefully, monitors beeping softly around her. She had gained weight, the doctors said. She was responding well to treatment. Against all odds, despite spending who knows how many hours in that freezing warehouse, she had no signs of hypothermia damage, no frostbite, no complications. It was, as one doctor told Torres, remarkably fortunate. "Remarkably fortunate," Torres repeated, looking down at the sleeping baby. Or something else. Detective Freeman called him 3 days later. "Captain Torres, this is Detective Freeman. I wanted to update you on the case. We found the mother. She's a 19-year-old woman named Jennifer Martinez. She's been living on the streets for about 8 months, got pregnant, had the baby alone in a shelter, and then..." Torres could hear the frustration in Freeman's voice. She panicked. She thought she couldn't take care of the baby, thought the child would be better off dead than living the way she was living. So she took her to that warehouse, left her there, and walked away. Torres felt his chest tighten. She intended for the baby to die. "Yes," Freeman said bluntly. "She's been charged with attempted murder and child abandonment, but here's the thing, and this is why I'm calling you." When we interviewed her, she said something strange. She said she left the baby with the Virgin Mary, that she prayed before she left, asking Mary to take care of her child because she couldn't. She said she knew it was wrong, knew she should have taken the baby to a hospital or a fire station, but she wasn't thinking clearly. She was desperate and terrified, and not in her right mind. Torres was quiet for a moment. "The statue." "Exactly," Freeman said. "We went back to get it, to log it as evidence. But Captain, that statue, it's not like any statue I've ever seen. We had it examined by an art expert, just out of curiosity. It's handmade, probably from the 1920s or 1930s, Mexican origin, worth maybe a few $100s to a collector. But here's what's strange. There's no record of how it got to that warehouse. Jennifer Martinez says it was already there when she arrived. She says that's why she chose that room, because she saw the Virgin Mary and thought maybe that meant something. So no one knows where it came from," Torres said slowly. "No one knows," Freeman confirmed. "And there's one more thing. The building superintendent. We finally tracked him down. He says that warehouse should have been about 15 degrees inside that night. The heating's been off for 3 years. There's no insulation, windows are broken. But when we measured the temperature in that room the next day, even after the building had time to normalize, it was warmer than the rest of the structure by about 20 degrees. We can't find any explanation for it. Torres ended the call and sat in his truck in the station parking lot, staring at nothing. His crew had said the same thing, had felt the warmth, had smelled the roses. They'd all written it in their reports, trying to be factual, trying to describe exactly what they'd experienced. But none of them had. Use the word everyone was thinking: miracle. That evening, Torres did something he hadn't done in years. He went to church. Not the cathedral downtown where tourists went, but the small parish church a few blocks from his house, the one his grandmother had taken him to as a child. It was empty except for an elderly woman praying in a front pew and a janitor quietly sweeping near the altar. Torres sat in the back, looking at the statues of saints along the walls, at the crucifix above the altar, at the small statue of the Virgin Mary in a side chapel, illuminated by flickering prayer candles. He thought about that night, about the fire that wasn't really a fire, about the baby who should have died but didn't, about the statue that seemed to watch over her, about the warmth and the scent of roses in a place where neither should have existed. His mind, trained to analyze and assess and find logical explanations, couldn't find one here. Or rather, it could find only one explanation, and that explanation required him to believe in something beyond the physical world, beyond training and equipment and procedure. Torres bowed his head, and for the first time in decades, he prayed. Not with memorized words from childhood, not with formal phrases, but with his heart. "If you were there," he whispered, "if you kept that baby alive, thank you. Thank you for letting us find her in time. Thank you for whatever it was that happened in that warehouse." There was no answer, no voice from heaven, no sudden revelation. But Torres felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name but recognized as important. Peace, maybe. Or acceptance, or simply the willingness to believe that the world contained more mystery than his training had prepared him for. When he left the church 30 minutes later, the night was still cold, but somehow it didn't bother him as much. He drove home to Maria, to his children, to his life, carrying with him the memory of holding a baby who should have died but didn't, of a statue that might have been more than just painted plaster, of a night when the impossible felt suddenly, undeniably possible. January brought answers and more questions. Baby Rosa was placed in foster care with a family who had been approved for emergency placements. Torres learned this from Detective Freeman, who had stayed in touch, partly for the case and partly because she, too, couldn't stop thinking about that night. Jennifer Martinez was undergoing psychiatric evaluation. Her public defender was arguing for treatment rather than prison, claiming postpartum depression and psychosis, claiming she wasn't in her right mind when she abandoned her baby. The legal system would decide her fate, but that wasn't what kept Torres awake at night. What kept him awake was the statue. After the investigation concluded, after all the evidence was documented and photographed, the statue of the Virgin Mary was supposed to be returned to the warehouse or disposed of, since no owner could be located. But Torres couldn't let that happen. He spoke with Detective Freeman, who spoke with her superiors, who spoke with the property management company, and somehow, through a maze of bureaucracy and paperwork, Torres was given permission to take the statue. Not officially as evidence, not officially as property, but as a finder who wanted to preserve something that had significance. He brought it home on a Saturday morning. Maria was in the kitchen when he carried it in, and she stopped mid-motion, coffee cup halfway to her lips, staring at the statue in his arms. "Michael," she said quietly. "Is that it is," Torres said. He set it carefully on their dining room table. Maria approached slowly, reaching out to touch the blue robes, her fingers tracing the painted folds. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Torres told her everything then, everything he hadn't quite been able to explain over the phone or in the brief conversations they'd had since Christmas Eve. He told her about the warmth in that freezing room, about the scent of roses, about the feeling that something beyond his understanding had been present that night. Maria listened without interrupting, her hand still resting on the statue. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I believe you." Torres looked at his wife. This woman he'd been married to for 26 years and saw tears in her eyes. I believe that something miraculous happened that night. I believe this statue was there for a reason. I believe that baby is alive because of more than just luck. They placed the Virgin Mary in their living room, in a corner near the window where the morning light would illuminate her. Torres found himself stopping to look at her throughout the day, sometimes just for a moment, sometimes for longer. His children noticed. His daughter, Elena, 16, asked him one evening why he'd brought home a religious statue when he'd never been particularly religious before. Torres tried to explain, but words felt inadequate. How do you describe the feeling of holding a life that should have been lost? How do you explain warmth and roses in a place where neither should exist? In February, Torres got a call from the foster family caring for Rosa. They'd heard he was the firefighter who found her, and they wanted to meet him, to thank him. Torres drove to their home, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, and met David and Susan Fletcher, a couple in their late 30s who had been fostering children for 5 years. Rosa was thriving, Susan told him, showing him into the nursery where the baby lay in a crib, awake and alert. She's healthy, she's gaining weight, she's hitting all her developmental milestones. The doctors say it's remarkable considering what she went through. Remarkable, Torres repeated, that word again. He looked down at Rosa, who looked back at him with those same dark, aware eyes he remembered from that night in the warehouse. She seemed to recognize him, though he knew that was probably his imagination. Babies this young don't remember faces from brief encounters weeks ago. But still, when he reached down and she wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, he felt it again, that sense of connection, of purpose, of having been part of something larger than himself. On his way home, Torres stopped at the church again. It had become a habit now, stopping by once or twice a week, sitting in the quiet, thinking, praying, trying to understand. Father Miguel, the parish priest, an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, had started recognizing him, would nod and smile but never intrude on Torres' solitude. This time, though, Torres approached him after Mass. "Father, I need to ask you something." They sat in the priest's office, a small room filled with books and papers and a large crucifix on the wall. Torres told him the story, all of it, leaving nothing out. When he finished, Father Miguel was quiet for a long time. "You want to know if it was a miracle?" the priest finally said. Torres nodded. "I've spent my whole life believing in what I can see, what I can measure, what I can prove." But that night, he trailed off. "That night you experienced something that can't be explained by those standards," Father Miguel finished. "My son, I've been a priest for 42 years. I've heard many stories, seen many things. Some have natural explanations, some don't. A miracle isn't always about the supernatural overriding the natural. Sometimes it's about grace, working through circumstances, through timing, through the actions of good people like you and your crew. Did the Virgin Mary keep that baby warm? Did she guide you to that warehouse at that exact moment? Did she fill that room with the scent of roses? I don't know. What I do know is that a child who should have died lived. A man who had lost his faith found it again. A family has a chance to love and raise a little girl who needs them. Whether you call that coincidence or providence or miracle, does it change the result? Torres sat with those words, turning them over in his mind. "No," he said finally, "it doesn't change the result." Father Miguel smiled. "Then perhaps that's your answer. Faith isn't about proving the unprovable. It's about trusting that even in the darkest, coldest places, we're not alone." Torres returned home that evening to find Maria sitting in the living room, reading by the light of a lamp, the statue of the Virgin Mary visible in her peripheral vision. He sat beside his wife, and she leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of shared life. "Michael," Maria said after a while, "do you think you'll ever know for certain what happened that night?" Torres looked at the statue, at the serene face, at the blue robes that seemed to glow softly in the lamplight. "No," he said, "I don't think I will. And you know what? I think I'm okay with that." March came, and with it, news that Jennifer Martinez had accepted a plea deal. She would serve 2 years in a psychiatric facility, followed by probation and mandatory counseling. She would not be allowed to have custody of Rosa, but she could, eventually, have supervised visitation if she completed her treatment successfully. Torres didn't know how he felt about that. Part of him, the father part, was angry at what she'd done, but another part, the part that had grown over these months, felt compassion. She had been desperate, alone, terrified, and unwell. She had made a terrible decision, but she had also, in her own broken way, tried to give her child a chance by leaving her with the Virgin Mary. On a Sunday morning in late March, Torres's entire crew, Danny, Sarah, and Jake, came to his house for breakfast. Maria made her famous chilaquiles, and they sat around the table, talking and laughing and being together. It had become a monthly tradition since Christmas, this gathering of the crew who had shared that extraordinary night. At some point, Jake asked if there had been any updates on Rosa. Torres told them about the Fletchers, about how well she was doing, about the possibility of them adopting her permanently if Jennifer's parental rights were terminated. "She's going to be okay," Sarah said, and there was certainty in her voice. She was meant to survive that night. Torres looked at each of his crew members, these people he trusted with his life, who had been with him in that warehouse, who had felt what he felt. "Do you all still think about it?" he asked. "Every day," Danny said immediately. Sarah and Jake nodded. "There are things you see in this job that stay with you," Sarah said, "things that change you. That night changed me." "It changed all of us," Torres said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own memories of that Christmas Eve, of a freezing warehouse and a crying baby and a statue that might have been more than just painted plaster. Later, after breakfast, after his crew had left, Torres stood alone in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary. The afternoon sun was streaming through the window, illuminating her face, and for just a moment, Torres could have sworn he saw her smile. Just a slight upturn of the lips, a softening of the expression, so subtle it might have been a trick of the light. But Torres had learned, over these past months, that sometimes the most important things are the ones we can't quite prove, the ones that exist in the space between knowing and believing. "Thank you," he said softly, his hand resting on the blue robes. "Thank you for that baby. Thank you for bringing me back to something I didn't know I'd lost." The statue, of course, said nothing. But in the quiet of that moment, Torres felt what he'd felt in that warehouse on Christmas Eve: warmth, peace, the scent of roses, and the absolute certainty that he was not, had never been, and would never be alone. Outside, the Denver afternoon was bright and cold, the mountains visible in the IE. Distance. Snow still capping their peaks. Inside, Michael Torres stood before a statue of the Virgin Mary, a man who had been a skeptic, who had believed only in what he could see and touch and prove, and who now believed in something more, something that couldn't be measured or documented or explained in a report, something that felt, impossibly, undeniably, like grace.